Elon Musk confronts abusive landlord, then changes the tenant's life forever. It was a dreary Tuesday afternoon in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of town. The kind of place where every creaky floorboard told a story of neglect, and every peeling layer of paint whispered broken promises. The tenants, a mix of struggling families and weary individuals, had long resigned themselves to their landlord's unjust reign. Rent hikes without notice, broken plumbing left unrepaired for weeks, and threats of eviction hung over their heads like storm clouds. On this particular day, Sarah Jenkins, a single mother of 2 young children, sat nervously at her kitchen table. A letter clutched in her trembling hands bore the bold, unforgiving words, "Final notice of eviction." Her rent was 2 weeks late, and despite her pleas for an extension, the landlord, Richard Dobson, had refused to listen. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the hallway, the type of knock that wasn't a request but a demand. Sarah's heart raced as she peered through the peephole. There he was, Dobson himself, a stout, balding man with an air of arrogance and a clipboard clutched in his meaty hand. "Open up, Sarah," he barked, his voice loud enough for the entire building to hear. "I know you're in there." Inside her apartment, Sarah froze. Her 2 children, huddled in the corner with their coloring books, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She took a deep breath and opened the door a crack. "Mr. Dobson," she said timidly, "I just need a little more time. I'll have the money by the end of the month." Dobson shoved the door open, stepping inside without invitation. "You've had your time, Jenkins," he growled, his tone dripping with disdain. "Rules are rules. If you can't pay, you can't stay. I've got someone ready to take this unit by tomorrow." "But I have children," Sarah protested, her voice breaking. "We have nowhere else to go." Dobson sneered, his beady eyes narrowing. "Not my problem, sweetheart. Maybe you should have thought of that before living rent-free on my dime." Sarah's face flushed with shame and anger, but before she could respond, a voice called out from behind Dobson. "Is there a problem here?" Both Sarah and Dobson turned toward the hallway. A tall man in a sharp suit stood there, his posture calm but commanding. It was Elon Musk, though none of the tenants seemed to recognize him yet. To them, he was just another stranger who had appeared in the crumbling complex earlier that day, supposedly looking for a rental. Dobson turned toward the newcomer, sizing him up with a sneer. "This doesn't concern you, buddy," he snapped. "Keep walking." Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locked on Dobson with a quiet intensity. "It concerns me if I'm considering living here," he said evenly. "And so far, what I'm seeing isn't exactly convincing." Dobson's expression soured further. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, puffing out his chest, "but I run things around here. And if you're not here to pay rent, then you can mind your own business." Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "It sounds like you run things with a little too much enthusiasm," he said, his tone cool but pointed. "Forcing a mother and her children out of their home doesn't exactly scream good management." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Elon, her fear momentarily eclipsed by confusion. Who was this man, and why was he speaking up for her? Dobson's face turned a deep shade of red. "Look, pal," he spat, jabbing a finger in Elon's direction. "I don't need a lecture from some wannabe do-gooder. These tenants know the rules. Pay up or get out. End of story." Elon's expression didn't change. "That's a convenient perspective," he said calmly. "But maybe the rules are the problem." Dobson laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the hallway. "The problem? The problem is people like her," he said, pointing at Sarah. "Always expecting handouts, always making excuses. I'm running a business here, not a charity." Elon raised an eyebrow. "A business," he repeated. "Interesting. Would you say you run it ethically?" Dobson's laughter faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "It means," Elon said, his voice dropping slightly, "that the way you treat your tenants says a lot about your business. And about you." The tension in the hallway was palpable. Other tenants had begun to peek out from their doors, their curious faces forming a silent audience. Dobson, clearly uncomfortable under Elon's steady gaze, scowled. "Look, I don't have time for this," he snapped. He turned back to Sarah, thrusting the clipboard toward her. "You've got until tomorrow to get out. After that, your stuff's on the curb." With that, he stormed down the hallway, muttering under his breath. The tenants quickly retreated into their apartments, leaving Sarah and Elon alone in the tense silence. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know what good it'll do. He's not going to change." Elon turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "People like him rarely do," he said. "But that doesn't mean he should get away with it." Sarah frowned, unsure of what he meant. But before she could ask, Elon gave her a small nod and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. Inside her apartment, Sarah sank into a chair, her hands shaking. She didn't know who the stranger was or why he had intervened, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The following morning, the hallway buzzed with whispers. Dobson's tantrum had become the talk of the building, and the tenants were split between fear and reluctant admiration for the man who had dared to stand up to him. Sarah, however, felt the weight of the eviction notice like a stone in her chest. She had barely slept, and the faint light of dawn had done little to soothe her racing thoughts. Meanwhile, Elon was standing in the building's cramped, dimly lit laundry room. He leaned casually against the wall, observing the disrepair around him. The machines rattled noisily, some sporting, out-of-order signs that looked like they had been taped up months ago. A young man in a worn hoodie was wrestling with a jammed coin slot, muttering curses under his breath. Elon stepped forward, speaking in an even tone. "Need a hand?" The young man glanced up, his expression a mixture of suspicion and frustration. "What are you, the repair guy?" he asked, his voice sharp. "No," Elon replied simply, "but I might be able to help." The young man scoffed but stepped aside, gesturing to the machine. "Be my guest. Dobson sure won't lift a finger." Elon crouched down, examining the mechanism. After a moment, he adjusted a misaligned lever and freed the jammed coin. The machine whirred to life, and the young man blinked in surprise. "Thanks, I guess," he muttered, his tone begrudging. Elon stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I'm guessing this kind of thing happens often." The young man snorted. "Are you kidding? This place is falling apart. Dobson's a joke. He won't fix anything unless it costs him money. And even then, he finds ways to charge us for it." Elon nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the cracked tiles and flickering fluorescent lights. "And no one's called him out on it? Who's gonna risk it?" The young man shot back. "You stand up to Dobson, and you're out on the street. Just ask Jenkins down the hall." Elon's expression darkened, but he said nothing further. As the young man turned to leave, Elon called out, "What's your name?" "Mark," the young man replied over his shoulder, before disappearing down the corridor. Elon lingered in the laundry room for a moment longer, his mind working quickly. He had already seen enough to confirm what he suspected. This building wasn't just poorly managed. It was a breeding ground for exploitation. Back in her apartment, Sarah was pacing the worn linoleum floor. Her kids sat quietly on the couch, their eyes wide with concern. She had managed to scrape together a few dollars from babysitting gigs, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the rent Dobson demanded. She knew she was running out of time. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it cautiously to find her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, standing there with a casserole dish in hand. "I heard what happened yesterday," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice warm but laced with worry. "I thought you might need this." Sarah accepted the dish with trembling hands, her gratitude overwhelming. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I don't know how much longer we'll even be here." Mrs. Wilson sighed, shaking her head. "Dobson's been like this for years. He's a bully, plain and simple. I've seen him drive out good families just because he could. It's disgusting." Sarah nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I just don't understand how he gets away with it." "He gets away with it because we let him," came a voice from further down the hall. Both women turned to see Elon leaning casually against the doorframe of an adjacent unit. He stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. People like Dobson thrive on fear and silence. But that doesn't mean we have to keep playing by his rules. Mrs. Wilson studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed. And what do you suggest we do? Elon's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Mrs. Wilson. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up, he said. The rest follows. Sarah frowned, uncertainty clouding her expression. But if we stand up and he retaliates, what happens to us then? Change always comes with risk, Elon said simply. But the alternative is letting him keep people like you living in fear. Before Sarah could respond, another door down the hall creaked open. A wiry man in his late 30s poked his head out, his expression wary. You planning to take Dobson down or something? He asked, his tone half joking but edged with curiosity. Not alone, Elon replied. But with enough voices, it's possible. The man chuckled humorlessly. Good luck with that. People around here talk a big game. But when it comes time to act, everyone goes quiet. Elon tilted his head, his gaze steady. Maybe they just need someone to show them it's possible. The man shrugged, retreating back into his apartment. Mrs. Wilson lingered a moment longer before giving Sarah's arm a reassuring squeeze and heading back to her own unit. Alone once more, Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. Elon's words had struck a chord, but the fear of losing what little she had left loomed large. She glanced at her children, who were watching her with wide, expectant eyes, and felt a pang of guilt. How could she protect them if she couldn't even protect herself? Meanwhile, Dobson was making his rounds, clipboard in hand and scowl firmly in place. He stopped in front of the laundry room, where Elon stood inspecting a loose water pipe. You again, Dobson barked. What are you doing? Elon straightened, brushing off his hands. Noticing a lot of things that need fixing. Dobson's face turned red. If you've got complaints, take them somewhere else. This isn't your business. Elon's gaze hardened. When people are being mistreated, it becomes everyone's business. Dobson sneered. You don't know what you're talking about. These tenants don't pay on time, they make a mess, and they expect me to clean up after them. You think I'm the bad guy? Try walking in my shoes. Maybe I will, Elon said evenly. And I'll start by making sure people know what kind of landlord you really are. Dobson's eyes narrowed, his bravado faltering for a brief moment before he recovered. You don't scare me, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Stay out of my way, or you'll regret it. Elon didn't respond, but as Dobson stormed off, the faintest hint of a smile played on his lips. He had seen men like Dobson before, blustering bullies who relied on intimidation to maintain control, and he knew exactly how to deal with them. The next morning, the building stirred uneasily. The whispers about the new tenant, the man who had spoken up against Dobson, were spreading like wildfire. Some tenants were cautiously intrigued, while others feared Dobson's inevitable retaliation. For years, they'd learned one harsh lesson. You don't cross Richard Dobson without consequences. Elon, however, was calm as ever. He had spent the early hours of the morning walking the property, noting every glaring maintenance failure and every neglected promise Dobson had made. Cracked windows that hadn't been replaced, pest infestations evident in the corners of the stairwell, exposed wiring in hallways. All signs of a landlord who cared more about squeezing rent out of his tenants than providing them with a safe place to live. Down the hall, Sarah struggled to gather her thoughts. Her youngest daughter tugged at her arm, looking for breakfast, but her cupboard was nearly bare. She had barely managed to sleep, worrying about the ticking clock on her eviction notice. As she poured the last of the cereal into a bowl, a loud knock startled her again. This time, it wasn't Dobson. It was Mrs. Wilson, her elderly neighbor, looking flustered and angry. Sarah, Mrs. Wilson said, clutching a crumpled letter. He's doing it again. Sarah frowned, taking the letter from her hands. It was an identical eviction notice, though Mrs. Wilson was only a few days late on her rent. But you're always on time, Sarah exclaimed. He knows you'll pay. Mrs. Wilson's lips trembled. He doesn't care. He's just trying to scare me out so he can raise the rent for the next tenant. I've seen him do it before. Sarah's heart sank. "We have to do something," she said, the fire in her voice surprising even herself. "I don't know what to do," Mrs. Wilson whispered, "but that man down the hall. What's his name? The one who confronted Dobson yesterday. Maybe he has an idea." Meanwhile, in the building's small courtyard, Elon was having a quiet conversation with Mark, the young man he had helped in the laundry room the day before. Mark leaned against the rusting railing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "So, you're planning to be some kind of hero?" Mark asked, skepticism thick in his voice. "Not a hero," Elon replied. "Just someone who's not afraid to say this isn't okay." Mark scoffed. "You don't get it. Dobson's untouchable. Every time someone's tried to stand up to him, he's crushed them. Fines, fake damage claims, harassment, he's got it all figured out. And if you push too hard, he'll make sure you're blacklisted from every rental in the city." Elon raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of power for one man." "Yeah, well, that's how it is around here," Mark said bitterly. "The system's built for guys like him. We're just stuck with it." Elon didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around the courtyard, taking in the faded graffiti on the walls and the overgrown weeds creeping through the cracks in the pavement. "Sometimes," he said finally, "it takes more than one voice to be heard." Mark shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Good luck finding anyone willing to risk it." Dobson, meanwhile, was making his rounds with a clipboard in hand, a smug expression plastered across his face. He had noticed the tenants whispering about the stranger who had spoken up, and it only fueled his resolve to reassert his authority. As he climbed the stairs, he stopped in front of Mrs. Wilson's apartment, rapping on the door with unnecessary force. "Mrs. Wilson," he barked, "open up." The elderly woman cracked the door open cautiously, her frail hands gripping the frame for support. "What do you want, Mr. Dobson?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You know what I want," Dobson sneered, waving the eviction notice in front of her. "Rent's overdue. Pay up by the end of the week or you're out." Mrs. Wilson swallowed hard. "But I've never been late before. You know, I'll have it in a few days." "A few days isn't good enough," Dobson interrupted. "Rules are rules." Before Mrs. Wilson could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What's the point of rules if they're only meant to hurt people?" Dobson turned to see Elon standing at the end of the hallway, his hands in his pockets and a calm but firm expression on his face. "Are you following me now?" Dobson growled. "I thought I told you to mind your own business. And I thought I made it clear that this is everyone's business," Elon replied, his tone steady. "You're targeting her because she's vulnerable just like you did with Sarah. It's not management. It's exploitation." Mrs. Wilson glanced between the two men, her fear momentarily giving way to a flicker of hope. Dobson stepped toward Elon, his posture aggressive. "You've got a lot of nerve, coming into my building and telling me how to run things." "Your building?" Elon repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Last I checked, it's the tenants who make this place run. You just collect the checks." Dobson's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Listen, pal," he spat, "you don't know anything about me or how I run my business. These people are lucky I even let them live here." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "If this is your idea of generosity, I'd hate to see your idea of fairness." Dobson opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of a door creaking open interrupted him. One by one, tenants began to peek out from their apartments, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. For the first time in years, Dobson seemed to realize that he wasn't the only one in control of the narrative. Later that day, Elon sat on a bench in the courtyard, scribbling notes into a small notebook. He had spent the afternoon listening to the tenants' stories, each one a testament to Dobson's unchecked abuse of power. Broken promises, retaliatory fines, threats of eviction. It was a pattern as clear as it was infuriating. Sarah approached cautiously, her children trailing behind her. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, her voice hesitant. "But thank you." Elon looked up, offering a small smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "What Dobson's doing isn't just wrong. It's illegal. And the more we expose it, the harder it'll be for him to keep getting away with it." But what if he retaliates? Sarah asked, her worry evident. He's not going to just let this slide. He won't have a choice, Elon said firmly. Not if we stand together. Sarah nodded slowly, her fear beginning to give way to determination. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dobson sat in his cramped office, fuming. He had spent the entire day dealing with tenants emboldened by the stranger's interference. It was a headache he hadn't anticipated, and he was already planning his next move. But what Dobson didn't realize was that his control over the building was beginning to crack. And by the time he understood the full extent of what was happening, it would be too late. By now, the tension in the building had reached a boiling point. The tenants were caught between decades of conditioned fear and the glimmer of hope sparked by Elon's calm defiance. For the first time in years, whispers of rebellion floated through the hallways. But Dobson wasn't about to let his authority slip away without a fight. Elon, meanwhile, had spent the day quietly working behind the scenes. He had spoken to nearly every tenant in the building, cataloging their grievances and identifying patterns in Dobson's exploitation. Leaking roofs, arbitrary rent increases, unfulfilled promises of maintenance. Each story painted a picture of a landlord who thrived on intimidation and neglect. In Sarah's apartment, the atmosphere was heavy with anxiety. She sat at her rickety kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills and eviction notices. Across from her, Elon was reviewing a worn ledger that Mrs. Wilson had loaned him. It contained decades of notes about the building, dates when repairs had been promised but never completed, receipts for dubious fees Dobson had charged, and letters from tenants who had been forced out under questionable circumstances. "This is more than enough to make a case against him," Elon said, his voice calm but resolute. "The question is whether everyone's willing to stand together." Sarah looked up from her bills, her expression doubtful. "People are scared," she said softly. "They've seen what Dobson can do. And even if they want to fight back, most of us can't afford to lose our homes." Elon leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The truth is, Dobson's power comes from the illusion that he's untouchable. If enough people challenge him, that illusion falls apart." "But what happens if he retaliates?" Sarah asked. "What happens to people like Mrs. Wilson, who can't afford to start over?" Elon's gaze softened. "That's why we have to be strategic," he said. "This isn't just about standing up to Dobson. It's about making sure he can't retaliate." Sarah nodded slowly, though her worry lingered. She glanced at her children, who were playing quietly in the corner, and felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Down the hall, Mark and a few other tenants had gathered in the laundry room, their voices low but urgent. The room smelled faintly of detergent and mildew, and the flickering fluorescent light cast eerie shadows on the walls. "This is getting out of hand," one tenant said, her arms crossed tightly. "Dobson's been sniffing around my unit, asking questions. I think he knows we've been talking." Mark shook his head, his jaw tight. "Let him sniff. He's just trying to scare us. The question is, are we gonna let him?" The others exchanged uneasy glances. For years, they had endured Dobson's bullying in silence, each hoping to avoid his wrath by keeping their heads down. But now, with Elon in the picture, the status quo felt less certain. The tenants were beginning to realize that Dobson's power wasn't as absolute as they had once believed. "Look," Mark continued, his voice firm. "This guy, Elon, he's not afraid of Dobson. And if he's willing to stand up to him, why can't we?" "Because we don't have anything to fall back on," another tenant shot back. "If Dobson kicks us out, we're screwed. It's not like Elon's gonna pay our rent." Elon didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around the courtyard, taking in the faded graffiti on the walls and the overgrown weeds creeping through the cracks in the pavement. "Sometimes," he said finally, "it takes more than one voice to be heard." Mark shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Good luck finding anyone willing to risk it." Dobson, meanwhile, was making his rounds with a clipboard in hand, a smug expression plastered across his face. He had noticed the tenants whispering about the stranger who had spoken up, and it only fueled his resolve to reassert his authority. As he climbed the stairs, He stopped in front of Mrs. Wilson's apartment, rapping on the door with unnecessary force. "Mrs. Wilson," he barked. "Open up." The elderly woman cracked the door open cautiously, her frail hands gripping the frame for support. "What do you want, Mr. Dobson?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You know what I want," Dobson sneered, waving the eviction notice in front of her. "Rent's overdue. Pay up by the end of the week or you're out." Mrs. Wilson swallowed hard. "But I've never been late before. You know, I'll have it in a few days." "A few days isn't good enough," Dobson interrupted. "Rules are rules." Before Mrs. Wilson could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "What's the point of rules if they're only meant to hurt people?" Dobson turned to see Elon standing at the end of the hallway, his hands in his pockets and a calm but firm expression on his face. "Are you following me now?" Dobson growled. "I thought I told you to mind your own business. And I thought I made it clear that this is everyone's business," Elon replied, his tone steady. "You're targeting her because she's vulnerable just like you did with Sarah. It's not management. It's exploitation." Mrs. Wilson glanced between the two men, her fear momentarily giving way to a flicker of hope. Dobson stepped toward Elon, his posture aggressive. "You've got a lot of nerve, coming into my building and telling me how to run things." "Your building?" Elon repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Last I checked, it's the tenants who make this place run. You just collect the checks." Dobson's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Listen, pal," he spat, "you don't know anything about me or how I run my business. These people are lucky I even let them live here." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "If this is your idea of generosity, I'd hate to see your idea of fairness." Dobson opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of a door creaking open interrupted him. One by one, tenants began to peek out from their apartments, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. For the first time in years, Dobson seemed to realize that he wasn't the only one in control of the narrative. Later that day, Elon sat on a bench in the courtyard, scribbling notes into a small notebook. He had spent the afternoon listening to the tenants' stories, each one a testament to Dobson's unchecked abuse of power. Broken promises, retaliatory fines, threats of eviction. It was a pattern as clear as it was infuriating. Sarah approached cautiously, her children trailing behind her. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, her voice hesitant. "But thank you." Elon looked up, offering a small smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "What Dobson's doing isn't just wrong. It's illegal. And the more we expose it, the harder it'll be for him to keep getting away with it." "But what if he retaliates?" Sarah asked, her worry evident. "He's not going to just let this slide." "He won't have a choice," Elon said firmly. "Not if we stand together." Sarah nodded slowly, her fear beginning to give way to determination. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dobson sat in his cramped office, fuming. He had spent the entire day dealing with tenants emboldened by the stranger's interference. It was a headache he hadn't anticipated, and he was already planning his next move. But what Dobson didn't realize was that his control over the building was beginning to crack. And by the time he understood the full extent of what was happening, it would be too late. By now, the tension in the building had reached a boiling point. The tenants were caught between decades of conditioned fear and the glimmer of hope sparked by Elon's calm defiance. For the first time in years, whispers of rebellion floated through the hallways. But Dobson wasn't about to let his authority slip away without a fight. Elon, meanwhile, had spent the day quietly working behind the scenes. He had spoken to nearly every tenant in the building, cataloging their grievances and identifying patterns in Dobson's exploitation. Leaking roofs, arbitrary rent increases, unfulfilled promises of maintenance. Each story painted a picture of a landlord who thrived on intimidation and neglect. In Sarah's apartment, the atmosphere was heavy with anxiety. She sat at her rickety kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills and eviction notices. Across from her, Elon was reviewing a worn ledger that Mrs. Wilson had loaned him. It contained decades of notes about the building, dates when repairs had been promised but never completed, receipts for dubious fees Dobson had charged, and letters from tenants who had been forced out under questionable circumstances. "This is more than enough to make a case against him," Elon said, his voice calm but resolute. "The question is whether everyone's willing to stand together." Sarah looked up from her bills, her expression doubtful. "People are scared," she said softly. "They've seen what Dobson can do. And even if they want to fight back, most of us can't afford to lose our homes." Elon leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The truth is, Dobson's power comes from the illusion that he's untouchable. If enough people challenge him, that illusion falls apart." "But what happens if he retaliates?" Sarah asked. "What happens to people like Mrs. Wilson, who can't afford to start over?" Elon's gaze softened. "That's why we have to be strategic," he said. "This isn't just about standing up to Dobson. It's about making sure he can't retaliate." Sarah nodded slowly, though her worry lingered. She glanced at her children, who were playing quietly in the corner, and felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Down the hall, Mark and a few other tenants had gathered in the laundry room, their voices low but urgent. The room smelled faintly of detergent and mildew, and the flickering fluorescent light cast eerie shadows on the walls. "This is getting out of hand," one tenant said, her arms crossed tightly. "Dobson's been sniffing around my unit, asking questions. I think he knows we've been talking." Mark shook his head, his jaw tight. "Let him sniff. He's just trying to scare us. The question is, are we gonna let him?" The others exchanged uneasy glances. For years, they had endured Dobson's bullying in silence, each hoping to avoid his wrath by keeping their heads down. But now, with Elon in the picture, the status quo felt less certain. The tenants were beginning to realize that Dobson's power wasn't as absolute as they had once believed. "Look," Mark continued, his voice firm. "This guy, Elon, he's not afraid of Dobson. And if he's willing to stand up to him, why can't we?" "Because we don't have anything to fall back on," another tenant shot back. "If Dobson kicks us out, we're screwed. It's not like Elon's gonna pay our rent." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe not," he said. "But if we don't do something, this'll just keep happening. How long are we supposed to live like this?" The room fell silent, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. One by one, the tenants began to nod, their fear slowly giving way to a flicker of determination. In Dobson's office, the landlord was pacing furiously. His desk was cluttered with papers, including a list of tenants he considered troublemakers. At the top of the list was Elon's name, circled in red ink. "I don't know who this guy thinks he is," Dobson muttered, his voice low and venomous. "But he's not gonna walk into my building and tell me how to do my job." One of Dobson's lackeys, a wiry man named Vince, stood awkwardly by the door. "Maybe it's time to back off a little," Vince suggested hesitantly. "People are starting to talk. And if this guy keeps poking around, he might find something." Dobson whirled on him, his eyes blazing. "You think I'm scared of some wannabe hero?" he snapped. "Let him dig all he wants. I've been running this place for 20 years, and nobody's taken me down yet." Vince shifted uncomfortably but said nothing further. Dobson's arrogance was well known, but even he could sense that something was different this time. Elon wasn't just another disgruntled tenant. He was a disruptor, and Dobson had no idea how to deal with him. That evening, Elon sat on the front steps of the building, his notebook balanced on his knee. He was reviewing his notes when Mrs. Wilson approached, clutching a small envelope. "This is for you," she said, holding it out with trembling hands. Elon frowned, taking the envelope and opening it. Inside was a modest donation, clearly a portion of Mrs. Wilson's limited savings. "You don't have to do this," Elon said gently. "Your support is more than enough." Mrs. Wilson shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "You don't understand," she said. "This building has been my home for 40 years. If there's any chance of saving it, I want to help." Elon nodded, his respect for the elderly woman growing even deeper. "We'll make this right," he said. "I promise." As the night wore on, the tenants began to feel the first stirrings of unity. Conversations that had once been whispered in fear now carried an undercurrent of resolve. Dobson, however, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. But Elon knew that the real challenge was yet to come. The tenants' newfound courage was fragile, and Dobson still held the power to crush them if they weren't careful. It would take more than hope to dismantle the landlord's reign of terror. It would take strategy, determination, and, most importantly, the willingness to stand together. And Elon was determined to see it through. The morning dawned with an eerie stillness in the building. It felt like the calm before a storm. Dobson had been uncharacteristically quiet, and the tenants were holding their breath, waiting for his next move. Meanwhile, Elon remained calm and collected, working quietly in Sarah's apartment, finalizing the plan he had been crafting for days. Around mid-morning, the tension broke when Dobson stormed into the courtyard with Vince and another lackey in tow. He was red-faced and visibly enraged, waving a thick stack of papers that looked like eviction notices. The tenants who had been outside froze in place, fear flashing across their faces as Dobson began shouting. "You think you can cross me?" Dobson bellowed, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "You think I don't know what's going on? Talking behind my back, stirring up trouble. Well, let me make one thing clear, you're all replaceable." Mark, who had been leaning against the wall, stepped forward, his jaw tight. "You can't keep doing this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "People are tired of being bullied." Dobson turned on him like a predator, pointing a finger in his face. "Tired? You think I care? You're lucky to have a roof over your head at all. You don't like it? There's the door." "That's enough," another voice cut in, calm but firm. Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Elon was standing at the edge of the courtyard, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Dobson's sneer widened. "Ah, the self-appointed hero," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you gonna do, pal? Give me a lecture about ethics?" Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Dobson's with a quiet intensity that made even the landlord falter for a moment. "I've been patient," Elon said finally, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. "I've watched you intimidate and exploit these people, and I've listened to their stories. You've built your little empire on fear and manipulation. But that stops today." Dobson laughed, though it sounded forced. "And who do you think you are? Some kind of lawyer? Let me guess. You're gonna sue me?" Elon's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Not a lawyer," he said, "but I do have resources, and I've already filed formal complaints with the Housing Authority, the Health Department, and local legal aid organizations. Every violation in this building is documented, and every tenant is ready to testify." Dobson's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You think that scares me? I've dealt with threats before. Nothing's gonna come of it." Elon took another step forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You're right," he said. "A few complaints probably wouldn't mean much. But when they're backed by someone with significant influence, it's a different story." It was then that Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek metal card, holding it up for Dobson to see. It bore the unmistakable logo of one of his companies, along with his name, Elon Musk, CEO. The courtyard fell silent. The tenants stared in stunned disbelief, their brains struggling to process the revelation. Even Dobson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "You're," Dobson stammered, his bravado faltering. "You're Elon Musk?" Elon nodded, slipping the card back into his pocket. "That's right. And unlike you, I don't tolerate bullies." The tenants erupted into murmurs, their shock quickly giving way to a sense of awe and newfound confidence. Sarah clutched her hands to her chest, her eyes wide as she whispered, "I knew he was different, but I never imagined." Dobson, however, was scrambling to regain control. "This doesn't change anything," he shouted, though his voice lacked its usual force. "I'm the landlord here, and You'll do nothing," Elon interrupted, his voice sharp. "Because as of this morning, this building is no longer yours." Dobson froze. His Elon reached into his pocket again and pulled out another document, unfolding it with deliberate care. "This," he said, holding it up, is the deed to the building. I bought it from the bank that holds your mortgage. Apparently, you've been defaulting on payments, and they were more than happy to sell." Dobson's jaw dropped, his eyes darting between the document and Elon's unyielding expression. You can't do this," he sputtered. "I already did," Elon replied calmly. "And as the new owner, my first act is to void every eviction notice you've issued. My second act is to order a full audit of every financial transaction you've made with your tenants. And my third act is to evict you, face going pale." "What are you talking about?" he demanded. The courtyard erupted in cheers. The tenants, who had lived in fear for so long, were now shouting and clapping, their relief and joy palpable. Sarah hugged her children tightly, tears streaming down her face. Even Mrs. Wilson, who had rarely left her apartment in years, appeared in the doorway, her smile radiant. Dobson, however, was seething. "You think you've won?" he snarled, his voice barely audible over the noise. "You don't know who you're messing with." Elon stepped closer, his expression unflinching. "Neither do you," he said, "but you're about to find out." With that, Elon turned to Vince and the other lackey. "You can leave with him, or you can stay and help me fix this place," he said simply. "Your choice." Vince hesitated, glancing at Dobson before stepping away from him. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I'm not going down with you." Dobson's shoulders slumped, the fight finally leaving him. He turned and stormed out of the courtyard, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence that followed. Elon turned back to the tenants, his expression softening. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's a lot of work to do, but you deserve better, and we're going to make it happen." Together, the tenants erupted into applause again, their gratitude and hope shining brightly. For the first time in years, the building felt alive with possibility. The buzz around the building was electric. Tenants moved freely in and out of their apartments, exchanging smiles and whispers of relief. For the first time in years, there was no lurking threat of Dobson's oppressive presence. Elon's intervention had sparked a profound change, and the tenants were finally breathing easier. Dobson, however, was far from accepting his fate. He sat hunched over a desk in the dimly lit office of a small-time attorney he had called on short notice. The attorney, a wiry man named Keller, flipped through the deed and transaction documents that Elon had presented earlier. "This is airtight," Keller muttered, shaking his head. "The bank had every right to sell the property, especially with your payment history. And Musk has the resources to make sure this sticks." Dobson slammed his fist on the desk, making Keller flinch. "You're supposed to be helping me," he barked, "not telling me I've already lost." "I'm being realistic," Keller replied, his tone growing more impatient. "This isn't something you can strong-arm your way out of. Musk isn't just some random tenant, he's Elon Musk. If you try to fight this, you're going to lose more than just the building." Dobson's face turned red with frustration. He had built his reputation on intimidation and control, and now it was all unraveling. The idea of being humbled, of being outplayed, was a bitter pill he refused to swallow. But Keller's words stuck with him, and for the first time, Dobson realized just how much he had underestimated his opponent. Back at the building, Elon had gathered the tenants in the courtyard for a meeting. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. Elon stood at the center, a whiteboard behind him covered in notes and sketches detailing plans for repairs, rent restructuring, and community projects. "Here's the deal," Elon began, his tone both serious and encouraging. "This building needs a lot of work, and it's going to take time. But with your help, we can turn this place into something better. A home that you can be proud of." The tenants nodded, their trust in Elon growing with every word. He outlined a plan to set up a tenants association, giving them a collective voice in decisions about the building. He also announced a fund he had created to cover emergency repairs and support for vulnerable residents like Mrs. Wilson. As the meeting went on, Dobson appeared at the edge of the courtyard, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He stood silently, watching as Elon inspired the very people Dobson had spent years oppressing. It was a sight that filled him with equal parts rage and helplessness. Mark noticed Dobson first and pointed him out to Elon. "Looks like the king has returned," he muttered. Elon turned to face Dobson, his expression calm but unyielding. "Mr. Dobson," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon." Dobson stepped forward, his movements stiff with anger. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You think you can just waltz in here, throw some money around, and erase everything I built?" Elon tilted his head, his gaze steady. "What you built was a system of exploitation," he replied. "It was never sustainable, and now it's gone." Dobson laughed bitterly, though it lacked conviction. "You're so full of yourself," he spat. "You don't know these people. They'll turn on you the moment things get hard." Elon's eyes swept across the crowd of tenants, who stood united behind him. "I don't think so," he said simply. "Because unlike you, I'm giving them a reason to believe things can get better." Dobson's sneer faltered as he realized just how outnumbered he was. The tenants, emboldened by Elon's presence, began to step forward, their voices rising in defiance. "You don't scare us anymore," Sarah said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "We're done letting you control our lives. You took everything from me," Mrs. Wilson added, her frail voice trembling with emotion. "My savings, my dignity. But not anymore." Mark stepped up, his jaw tight with determination. "You're finished here, Dobson. It's over." The chorus of voices grew louder, each tenant adding their own story to the wave of condemnation. Dobson, who had once thrived on his ability to divide and intimidate, found himself completely overwhelmed. In the days that followed, Dobson's downfall became a cautionary tale. The tenants filed a class action lawsuit against him, with Elon providing legal and financial support. The evidence of Dobson's misconduct, rigged fees, neglected repairs, and forged documents was overwhelming. News of the case spread quickly, and Dobson's name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Vince, Dobson's former lackey, provided crucial testimony against him, detailing the schemes and abuses he had witnessed. His decision to break away from Dobson earned him a measure of redemption in the eyes of the tenants, though he knew it would take time to rebuild their trust. Dobson, meanwhile, was forced to sell off what little remained of his assets to cover legal fees and restitution. His reputation was in shambles, and the power he had wielded so ruthlessly was gone. For the tenants, life in the building began to improve. Repairs were underway, the rent structure was reevaluated, and a sense of community flourished. Elon continued to work closely with the tenants, not just as their landlord but as an ally who truly cared about their well-being. One afternoon, as Elon walked through the courtyard, he spotted Dobson sitting on the steps, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a moment, Elon considered walking past him, but something made him stop. "Still here?" Elon asked, his tone neutral. Dobson looked up, his eyes hollow. "What do you want, Musk?" he muttered. "Nothing," Elon replied. "But maybe it's time you asked yourself what you want. Because the way you've been living, it's not sustainable." Dobson didn't respond, but the weight of Elon's words seemed to sink in. He sat silently as Elon walked away, his mind racing with thoughts he had avoided for years. By the end of the week, Dobson left the building for good. His absence was a cause for quiet celebration among the tenants, who now felt a sense of ownership and pride in their home. Elon's influence had not only exposed Dobson's abuses, but had also empowered the tenants to take control of their lives. For Dobson, the experience was a humbling one. Whether he chose to learn from it or not was ultimately up to him, but the legacy of his reign was clear. Power built on fear and greed would always crumble in the face of unity and hope. The once mighty Dobson stood at the threshold of his former empire, reduced to a shadow of his former self. The days following Elon's intervention had seen the unraveling of his carefully constructed web of manipulation and deceit. The tenants, united and resolute, had risen against him, while Elon's presence had tipped the scales irrevocably. Dobson returned to the building one last time, ostensibly to retrieve some personal belongings from his office. His arrival did not go unnoticed. A ripple of tension spread among the tenants, but it quickly gave way to quiet determination. They were no longer afraid of him. As Dobson trudged up the stairs, he encountered Sarah, who was helping Mrs. Wilson carry a bag of groceries to her apartment. The sight of the elderly woman, frail but smiling for the first time in years, filled Dobson with a pang of something unfamiliar: guilt. "Sarah," he said gruffly, his voice devoid of its usual venom. Sarah straightened, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Dobson?" "I'm just here to get my things," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "You mean the things you bought with the money you stole from us?" She shot back. "Don't expect sympathy from anyone here." Dobson opened his mouth to reply but found he had no defense. He nodded curtly and continued up the stairs, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical burden. When Dobson reached his office, he found the door ajar. Inside, Vince was packing up boxes, his movements efficient and businesslike. Vince glanced up when Dobson entered but didn't stop what he was doing. "What are you doing here?" Dobson demanded, his voice cracking. "Helping clean up the mess you left," Vince replied evenly. "Elon asked me to take care of it." "Elon?" Dobson scoffed. "So you're working for him now?" Vince paused, his gaze hardening. "I'm not working for anyone. I'm trying to make amends for the damage I helped you cause." Dobson sneered, but the usual fire behind his expression was absent. "You're just as guilty as I am," he said, though the words lacked conviction. Vince nodded. "You're right, I am, but at least I'm trying to make things right. What about you?" Dobson had no answer. He slumped into a chair, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his mistakes. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Vince taping up a box. Down in the courtyard, the tenants were hard at work. Mark was organizing a team to repaint the walls, while Sarah and Mrs. Wilson planted flowers in the garden. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a stark contrast to the years of despair they had endured under Dobson's reign. Elon watched from the sidelines, his presence calm and steady. He had made a point of staying out of the tenants' way, allowing them to take ownership of the transformation. This wasn't about him, it was about them. "Mr. Musk," Mark called, waving him over. "We could use an extra hand with the paint." Elon smiled and rolled up his sleeves. "Happy to help," he said, grabbing a roller. As he worked alongside the tenants, Dobson appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply watched, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. This was his building, or at least it had been, and now it was being rebuilt without him. Finally, Dobson stepped into the courtyard, drawing the attention of everyone present. The chatter and laughter died down as the tenants turned to face him, their expressions ranging from wary to defiant. "I just came to say, I'm leaving," Dobson said, his voice barely audible. "For good." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Sarah stepped forward. "Good," she said simply, her tone devoid of the anger that had fueled her before. "We don't need you here." Dobson nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I know," he murmured. To everyone's surprise, Elon walked over to Dobson and stood before him, his arms crossed. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, his voice devoid of judgment. Dobson looked up, meeting Elon's eyes for the first time. "I don't know," he admitted, "but maybe it's time I figured it out." Elon studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good luck," he said. "You're going to need it." Dobson's departure marked the end of an era. The tenants gathered in the courtyard to celebrate, their laughter and cheers filling the air. It was a moment of collective triumph, a testament to their resilience and unity. For Elon, the celebration was bittersweet. He had achieved what he set out to do, but he knew the journey was far from over. The building still needed repairs, and the tenants would face new challenges as they adjusted to their newfound independence. But for now, they had hope, and that was enough. As the sun set, Elon found himself alone in the courtyard, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. Sarah approached him, her 2 children in tow. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Elon smiled, crouching down to greet the kids. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You did this. All of you." Sarah shook her head. "We couldn't have done it without you. You gave us the strength to believe things could change." Elon stood, his smile softening. Then keep believing, he said, because this is just the beginning. Elon Musk's presence had been a catalyst, but the transformation belonged to the tenants. He had given them the tools and the opportunity, but they had been the ones to seize it, turning their collective despair into a shared hope for the future. Dobson's name was now a whisper, spoken only as a reminder of what had been overcome. He had left quietly, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the weight of his actions. For weeks, he stayed out of sight, reflecting on the choices that had led to his downfall. Whether he would change was uncertain, but his departure marked a new beginning for everyone else. Sarah, once terrified of speaking up, had become a leader in the Tenants Association. She was now the voice of the people, ensuring that no one ever felt powerless again. Mrs. Wilson, bolstered by the kindness of her neighbors, had regained her confidence and spent her days tending to the garden. Even Vince, who had once been Dobson's enforcer, was finding ways to make amends, helping with repairs and donating his time to the community. Elon, having accomplished his mission, prepared to step back. He had made it clear that this was their victory, not his. "You don't need me anymore," he told the tenants at their final meeting. "But if you ever do, you know where to find me." As he left the building for the last time, he paused at the courtyard. The sight of the tenants working together, their faces lit with determination and joy, filled him with a quiet sense of pride. He had come to help, but he had gained something unexpected: a renewed belief in the power of community. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on what this story teaches us. How many of us have faced situations where power was used to suppress rather than uplift? And how often do we feel like there's nothing we can do to change it? Elon's actions here serve as a reminder that change is always possible. It starts with standing up, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. The tenants in this story were once scared and divided, but with support and determination, they found their voice. They learned that unity is their greatest strength, and that even the most oppressive systems can crumble when people come together. But there's another lesson here, one about accountability. Dobson's downfall wasn't just about punishment. It was about holding him responsible for his actions. Too often, people in power abuse their position without consequences. This story shows us that change requires confronting those who exploit and harm others. It's not easy, but it's necessary. For Dobson, the experience was humbling. While the tenants moved forward with their lives, he was left to face the reality of his actions. And isn't that the greatest lesson of all? That true power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Dobson's downfall was inevitable because his foundation was built on fear. The tenants' rise, on the other hand, was built on trust and unity, and that's a legacy that will endure. Now, think about your own life. Have you ever seen injustice and wondered what you could do to help? Have you ever felt powerless like the tenants in this story? Remember that even the smallest actions can make a difference. Maybe you can stand up for someone who's being mistreated, or maybe you can join forces with others to create change. The point is, you have more power than you think. If the story inspired you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Let's keep the conversation going about standing up to injustice, about building communities where everyone feels safe and valued. And don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and let us know in the comments. What would you do if you saw someone being mistreated? How can we all be a little more like the tenants in this story, or like Elon? Thank you for watching, and remember, change starts with us. Together, we can create a world where kindness and courage prevail. See you in the next story.